For this experiment, I asked a group of everyday Windows users to do something most of them had either joked about or actively avoided for years. I asked them to install Linux and use it as their only operating system for one full week. No dual boot safety net, no I'll just switch back for work, no virtual machine. This was Linux as the daily driver from morning coffee to late night YouTube sessions. These were not Linux enthusiasts, developers, or terminal power users. These were normal people. Office workers, students, gamers, freelancers, and one person who probably told me they still used Internet Explorer until Microsoft killed it. I expected frustration, I expected complaints, I expected at least one rage quit. What I did not expect was how quickly their assumptions collapsed, and how uncomfortable the results would be for anyone who believes Linux is still too hard for regular users. On day 0, before anyone even touched Linux, I asked each participant what they thought would happen. Almost everyone said the same things in different words. They expected installation to be confusing, hardware not to work, apps to be missing, and the whole experience to feel unfinished or for nerds. One person said they expected to spend the entire week Googling terminal commands just to open files. Another said they assumed Linux would feel like Windows from 20 years ago, fast but ugly and limited. Gaming was the biggest fear. Several participants assumed games simply would not work at all, and one believed Linux still could not even connect to Wi-Fi without manual driver installs. These expectations matter because they mirror what millions of Windows users still believe today. We started with installation because historically this is where Linux scared people away. I deliberately did not sit next to them or guide them step by step. They were allowed to read what was on the screen, and that was it. The distros chosen were modern, mainstream options that real people actually recommend today, not obscure enthusiast builds. The reactions were immediate and honestly awkward for my own expectations. The installers looked familiar. Partitioning was optional, not mandatory. Language selection, keyboard layout, user account creation, and a progress bar that actually explained what was happening. One participant said it felt like installing Windows, except without the anxiety that something might go wrong at any moment. Another asked where the product key screen was because they were waiting for it. When the system rebooted into a ready-to-use desktop without asking them to sign into an online account, that alone got comments. Hardware support was the next surprise. Wi-Fi worked instantly on every laptop. Bluetooth headphones paired without drama. External monitors were detected correctly. Even printers, the ancient curse of computing, worked for most participants without additional steps. One user who had spent years fighting printer drivers on Windows stared at the Linux print dialog in disbelief when their printer appeared automatically. There were exceptions, of course. One gaming mouse software was missing advanced RGB controls, and a fingerprint reader on one laptop did not work. But the idea that nothing works on Linux collapsed almost immediately. The problems that did exist felt smaller and more specific than the blanket incompatibility people expected. The first real emotional test came when participants tried to do their normal daily tasks. Browsing the web, watching videos, managing files, and writing documents. This is where I expected complaints about unfamiliar interfaces. Instead, most people adapted faster than they expected. Modern Linux desktops do not look like experiments anymore. Windows-style layouts exist. Mac-style docks exist. Everything from panel placement to window behavior felt adjustable without digging through obscure settings. One participant said it felt like Windows, but calmer, as if fewer things were constantly trying to get their attention. Another noticed how quickly the system booted and how responsive it stayed even with multiple apps open. The idea that Linux is fast but inconvenient did not hold up. It was fast and unexpectedly comfortable. The app situation was where skepticism returned. People went looking for familiar names. Microsoft Office, Adobe Photoshop, certain proprietary tools. Some of these were missing, and that part was real. But what shocked participants was how often alternatives were already installed or easily discoverable. LibreOffice opened Word documents without drama. GIMP surprised people who had last seen it years ago and assumed it was still clunky. Web-based apps covered more ground than expected. One participant realized that most of their daily workflow already lived in a browser, which made the operating system underneath feel less important than they had assumed. Another said, somewhat annoyed, that Linux forced them to realize how little they actually depended on Windows-only software. Gaming was the biggest wildcard and the place where I expected the experiment to fail. Historically, this is where Linux lost people. But modern reality did not match outdated reputation. Steam installed easily. Proton was enabled with a checkbox. Games downloaded and launched. Some worked immediately. Some required minor tweaks. A few did not work at all. But the emotional shift was obvious. Participants went from "Linux can't game" to "wait, this actually runs better than I expected." One gamer noticed smoother frame pacing on Linux than on their bloated Windows install. Another was shocked that their controller worked instantly without driver downloads. The disappointment came not from total failure, but from specific titles with anti-cheat limitations. Even then, the reaction was frustration rather than resignation. Linux was no longer dismissed outright. It was judged on a game-by-game basis, which is a huge change. By the middle of the week, something interesting happened. People stopped talking about Linux as Linux. It became my computer. That shift is subtle but important. The operating system faded into the background. Updates happened quietly. No forced restarts appeared. No pop-ups begged them to upgrade or sign into cloud services. One participant said they felt oddly relaxed using their computer, as if it was finally doing what they asked instead of negotiating with them. Another commented on how updates felt respectful. They happen when chosen, not when demanded. For Windows users conditioned to accept interruptions as normal, this felt almost suspicious at first. Security and privacy also came up unexpectedly. Participants noticed that Linux did not push account logins or data syncing by default. There was no pressure to connect everything to a single ecosystem. One user said they felt like they owned their system again instead of renting it. This was not something I'd prompted. It emerged naturally from daily use. Even those who did not care deeply about privacy noticed the absence of tracking prompts and background services constantly phoning home. It changed their perception of what an operating system is allowed to do. Of course, the week was not perfect. There were moments of friction. Learning new software names was annoying for some. File locations felt different. Certain niche hardware tools were missing. One participant struggled with a professional application that simply did not have a Linux version, and running it through compatibility layers was not reliable enough for work. This person ultimately said they could not switch full-time yet, and that honesty matters. Linux did not magically solve every problem. But what shocked them was how small the list of blockers actually was. Instead of dozens of reasons, it came down to one or two specific tools. The emotional peak of the experiment came at the end of the week when I asked a simple question. Would you go back to Windows tomorrow if you didn't have to? The answer surprised even the participants themselves. Several said no, not immediately. One said they would dual boot, something they had never considered before. Another said they would keep Linux on their personal machine and Windows only for work requirements. One gamer said they would stick with Linux unless a specific game forced them back. Even the participant who could not switch fully admitted that Linux was far better than they had been led to believe, and that the problem was not Linux itself but software vendors ignoring it. What really shocked me was how quickly Windows itself came under scrutiny. After a week without forced updates, ads in the start menu, and background processes constantly eating resources, going back felt uncomfortable. Participants described Windows as noisy, heavy, and intrusive. Things they had tolerated for years suddenly felt optional. Linux did not win by being perfect. It won by being quiet, respectful, and predictable. It did not try to be everything. It simply tried to work. The biggest myth shattered by this experiment was that Linux is only for technical people. None of these participants used the terminal daily. Some never opened it at all. They installed software through graphical app stores. They changed settings through menus. They learned by exploring, not by memorizing commands. The idea that Linux requires constant technical knowledge felt outdated, like judging smartphones by early prototypes. Yes, advanced tools exist, and power users love them, but they are no longer mandatory for normal use. By the end, I realized the real barrier to Linux adoption is not usability, it is narrative. Most Windows users are operating on outdated information repeated so often that it feels true. When those assumptions are challenged by direct experience, the shock is real. Linux today is not a hobby project struggling to catch up. It is a mature, flexible platform quietly improving while most people are not looking. The results of this week were not that Linux is perfect, or that everyone should switch tomorrow. The result was something more dangerous to the status quo. Linux no longer feels impossible, it feels plausible. And once something feels plausible, the conversation changes. The question is no longer, can Linux replace Windows? The question becomes, why am I still using Windows if I don't have to? That question lingered with every participant after the experiment ended. Some answered it with caution, some with excitement, but none of them dismissed Linux anymore. For a week, they stepped outside of habit and expectation, and what they found was not frustration, but choice. And that, more than anything else, is what shocked me.